I'm going to tell the story of this kitchen extension, the design, the practical issues, the planning and building regulations, and what it would cost to build this today. If you are thinking of building an extension to a terraced house in the UK, this is the video for you. Terraced houses are the most popular type of dwelling in the UK. Almost 7 million homes are terraced. If you don't live in one, I am willing to bet you know someone who does. I've worked on loads of terraced houses over the years, and building kitchen extensions to the rear of these properties comes with unique challenges. My recent videos have been about redesigns of homes brought to me by clients for my online consultation service. I give advice to homeowners right across the UK, and sometimes I make videos about it, but this project is one of my own, in Edinburgh. I photographed this job a few months ago, but it took over 4 years to get to that point. This job had everything: objections from neighbours, massive cost increases, supply chain disruption, a contractor going into liquidation and coming back again to finish the project. If you want to skip ahead, there are chapter timestamps below. Let's get started. The existing house. The client bought this house in 2020 and shortly afterwards they commissioned me to renovate the property. They wanted to create a modern kitchen dining space at the rear to take advantage of the private garden. The house is 3 stories tall and dates from the late 19th century. It isn't listed, but it is in a conservation area. The interior was dated and the original kitchen was far too small by modern standards. All the properties in this row have a 1-story outshoot which originally contained washrooms and an outdoor toilet. This house had a bathroom under the stairs, added long ago by a previous owner. They also added a conservatory that was on its last legs by the time my client bought the house. The windows, heating and electrics also needed upgrading. One of the quirks of this property is that the garden does not run directly out from the back of the house. It's off at a noticeable angle. The extension design. The brief for this project covered a full renovation and internal redesign of the existing house, but to keep this video simple, I am only going to discuss the work on the ground floor, including the new extension. Right from the outset, we knew the outbuildings and conservatory needed to go. I planned to specify natural stone in the new extension by reusing as much as possible from the original structure. If you plan to knock a conjoined building like this in England or Wales, you need to serve a party wall notice, but this is Edinburgh and the Party Wall Act doesn't apply in Scotland. The first major design problem was accepting the limitations of creating an open plan space in a mid-terrace property. Because we could only extend out the back, the space would always be a rectangle. Now, if you have watched my other videos, you know I think rectangles make poor open plan spaces because everyone can see everyone else all of the time. In this house, we kept the front room as a formal living space, separate from the new extension at the rear, and that gives people somewhere else to go, to read or watch TV. If you are thinking of extending a mid-terrace property where you can't extend down the side to create an L-shaped open plan space, keep that in mind. From the outset, I worked hard to create a pantry accessed from the kitchen. This would house the fridge freezer to free up space in the kitchen itself. Because we got rid of the existing bathroom, the building regulations required that we create a new toilet. We couldn't leave the main floor of the house worse than it was before. The next issue we faced was the rear garden geometry. The client wanted the extension to take full advantage of the outdoor space. Right at the start of the feasibility study process, I hit on the idea of angling the back wall of the extension so that it was perpendicular to the garden. This angle here is 90 degrees to the boundary. The design evolved several times, but that idea remained constant throughout. Any seating against this wall will look directly down the length of the garden. Next up, to help subdivide the space, I had to think about the different uses within it. I didn't want to create a box. I wanted to subtly define separate kitchen, dining and living areas within the new space. The design evolved over time, but right from the start I thought an island would be central to separating the kitchen from the living area. I also persuaded the client of the value in creating an intermediate space between the extension and the garden. I've done this on several projects and clients love it. By spanning the roof out over the glazing, we create a sheltered deck where they can sit outdoors more often. This space is not quite inside, not quite outside, and at this stage in the design process, it encouraged us to forget about the windows in a wall and instead go for full sliding patio doors. The client was very keen on maximizing natural light. The property faces roughly east, so it would get the sun in the morning, but to get the sun later on in the day, the extension would need skylights. I've made other videos explaining why the amount of glass in a new extension is limited by the building regulations in order to conserve energy. There's a link in the description if you want to learn more. Even super high-tech triple glazed windows let out about 6 times as much heat as the walls they're built into in a modern extension. So to maximize the amount of glass, we did a compensatory heat loss calculation. This increased the insulation in the new walls, floor and roof to offset heat loss and maximize the natural light getting into the space. Back when this was designed, the Scottish building regulations allowed us to also take into account upgrading windows in the existing house as an offset against more glass in the extension, but that rule has since been changed. So we probably couldn't build quite as much glass in a similar extension today. Keep that in mind if you are planning a house extension. Check out what's allowed as early as possible so you don't have to change the design later on. To encourage light into the space, we decided to angle the roof towards the south. We could then design long skylights that would bring natural light deep into the building, but this caused a problem. The more we angled the roof, the taller the extension became, and eventually it would cast a shadow over this neighbour's garden. My client approached the neighbour, who turned out to be a retired planning officer. This was back during COVID lockdown, so we couldn't meet in person. Instead, we had a number of video calls where we went over our plans, and to keep the neighbour happy, we reduced the height of the roof and we removed this area of wall. The roof would cantilever here instead. I even produced 3D models of the extension, not something I usually do, but it made sure the neighbour could understand the design. Long story short, even though we changed the design to reduce the impact on the neighbour, they still objected during the planning application. And the planning officer asked me to demonstrate that our proposal would not adversely impact the neighbour by casting too much shadow on their rear garden. I was able to produce this shadow study using the 3D model I had made earlier. It proves that on the spring equinox, the amount of new shadow cast on the neighbour's garden was minimal, all in accordance with the published guidance. We got planning approval in early 2021 and moved on to the detailed design stage. We had decided the roof should be made from zinc because it's hard-wearing, long-lasting, low-maintenance, and it looks good. The extension would need to have a warm roof construction, with insulation on top of the rafters. I've explained this type of construction in previous videos, and there's a link in the description, but this was driven by changes in the building regulations. Having the insulation above the roof timbers creates the opportunity to expose those roof timbers. I specified large sections of Douglas fir because, aside from holding up the roof, they look good, have visible grain, and they add visual interest to the space. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get bored with large slabs of plasterboard, and I'm looking for ways to make walls and ceilings a bit more interesting. To make the most of the limited space, we decided early on to demolish this internal partition and take down the rear wall of the house. Now that involved fitting a large steel picture frame. This is it during construction: a pair of beams across the top, posts at the side, another pair of beams under the ground. Because the new space is at the back of the entrance hall, we needed to create a visual connection between the front door and the kitchen. A glass door is a great way to do this, but because the top floor of the property is more than 4.5 meters above ground level, the house is in the next category of fire risk. That means the door must be self-closing and fire resistant. The client sourced this crystal door to meet the requirements. It was expensive, but it does the job brilliantly. I also specified Siberian larch cladding on the outside of the extension, to the soffit of the roof overhang and down the side of this wall, where I created a storage area for garden tools. Storage was also considered inside the extension along this wall. The roof slopes down to a gully here, and I designed this area as a recess for that reason. Originally, I thought about creating bespoke shelves here, but as time went on, we became aware that world events were going to massively impact the job. Building the kitchen extension. In 2021, we started looking for a builder to carry out the work. Now back then, post-lockdown, every builder in Edinburgh was booked solid for months in advance. They were extremely busy and would not take part in a competitive tender process. The way I dealt with this was to carry out direct negotiations. I recommended a few trusted builders to my client, they met up, and the client picked one to work with based on past projects and references. It was that simple. The client eventually chose James as our contractor. He worked with several well-respected architects around Edinburgh, and I had been trying to get him onto one of my projects for over 2 years. James ran a small company focusing on high-quality alterations and renovations to private homes. This job was right up his street. The problem was that in 2021, construction costs were rising so fast it was impossible to keep track, and every week there seemed to be some new supply chain issue that meant we couldn't get materials on time or at all. The costs for this job went far higher than was originally intended, but the client chose to stick with it. We spent several months going back and forth with James to finalise the price, and construction began in April 2022. just in time for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This caused a further spike in material prices. The sanctions placed on Russian goods also meant that Siberian larch cladding was no longer coming into the UK. I advised the client to buy this timber as soon as possible, months ahead of when we actually needed it. The disruption didn't stop there, however. The original construction contract was to last 9 months, but not long after work began, James told us he would have to close his company because he was owed money by several former clients and rising costs had crippled his cash flow. This was a huge blow to everyone, especially James, who'd built his business up over many years. He eventually formed a new company with fewer staff, and to his eternal credit, he finished the job. Because his team was greatly reduced in size, it took 15 months rather than the original 9 to complete the work. James has an Instagram called Fixed Edinburgh. I've put a link in the description. He took the decision after finishing this job to no longer work as a main contractor. This project was his swan song. He now works on home repairs and small projects, and I can't recommend him enough. What would it cost to build this today? I spoke to the client a couple of months back when I took photos of the project. They now think they got excellent value for money, although it didn't feel like it at the time. A massive increase in construction costs, the contractor going into voluntary liquidation, and the project taking almost twice as long as expected would be too much for most people, but they are happy with the end result, and I am too. It's a design I am very proud of. The client asked me not to reveal what they spent on the project, and keep in mind this job involved a full renovation of a 3-story 19th century property, so the overall cost was significant. I am going to look at the kitchen extension on its own to see what it would take to create this in 2025. Taking into account the demolition, new steel frame, and high quality materials like zinc, Siberian larch, and sandstone walls, as well as crittle doors, new pantry and toilet, and underfloor heating, a job like this in 2025 would need a budget of at least £200,000 plus VAT, and that would not include the cost of new kitchen units. The client supplied this kitchen, and I don't know what they paid for it, but kitchen unit costs vary massively. Decent quality mass market kitchens start around £15,000, but they can easily cost twice that once you start specifying high-end appliances and marble worktops. It is possible to build an extension this size for less money. The going rate for house extensions in the UK throughout this year has been around £3,500 plus VAT per square metre. Doing fewer demolitions and using cheaper materials and less glass would bring the cost down noticeably, but the finished product wouldn't be to this standard. If you are thinking about altering or extending your property, check out the sponsor of today's video. Sunflex UK designs and manufactures high-quality aluminium windows and doors in the UK. I've used them on several of my own projects, and I believe they offer a great balance between cost and quality. Don't just take my word for it though, check out these videos I made, which include the costs. There's a link up here and in the description below. And if you would like my advice about your project, no matter where it is in the UK, check out the reallifearchitecture.co.uk website. You can book a consultation with me and get specific advice about your property. There's a link in the description, and please read the terms and conditions before you book. If you found this video useful, check out this playlist and be sure to drop a like. It really helps the channel.